In the winter of 1937, as the Imperial Japanese Army carved its way toward the Chinese capital of Nanjing, the Japanese public followed the campaign with total attention. On the home front, newspapers were filled with stories of imperial glory and military triumph, a narrative carefully curated by state censors to bolster morale and justify the war. But amidst the standard reports of battles won and territory seized, a different kind of story emerged. This narrative read less like a war dispatch and more like a sports update. It was designed to be thrilling and featured the almost unbelievable tale of a contest between two young officers. The goal wasn't to capture a bridge or secure a town, it was to see who could be the first to slay 100 men with a katana. The so-called athletes in this gruesome race were Second Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda. The press painted them as paragons of the Japanese martial spirit. Mukai, 26, was an expert in bayonet fighting, wielding his prized blade, the Seki no Magoroku. Noda, 25, carried a treasured ancestral sword. They were presented not as anonymous cogs in the war machine, but as relatable heroes, their friendly rivalry a source of national pride. Their banter, as reported by the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shinbun, was lighthearted and competitive, further cementing the sports-like atmosphere. For 2 weeks, the paper serialized the contest, publishing running tallies like a morbid box score. The story reached its sensational climax on December 13, 1937, the very day Japanese forces officially captured Nanjing. The headline was triumphant and declared that the final score was Mukai 106 to Noda's 105. Both men were said to have, quote, gone extra innings in their quest to win this morbid contest. Because both men had supposedly surpassed the century mark and couldn't determine a clear winner, they reportedly agreed to a new goal of 150 slayings. But was it all true? Or was this tale of a 100-man killing contest a carefully constructed piece of propaganda designed to mask a far more horrifying reality? The answer lies buried in the blood-soaked landscape between Shanghai and Nanjing, and in the decades-long battle over history that followed. The heroic narrative of the contest, as presented to the Japanese public, existed in a vacuum, deliberately scrubbed of its horrific context. The reality of the Imperial Japanese Army's advance from Shanghai to Nanjing in late 1937 was not a clean series of honorable duels. It was a 170-mile corridor of terror that historians have called a zone of total destruction. The actions of Mukai and Noda, far from being an exceptional feat of arms, were a symptom of a systemic culture of brutality that had taken root within the Japanese military. This culture was fostered by a confluence of factors. Logistically, the army was often poorly supplied, leading to an implicit policy of living off the land. While this was officially just kept to looting, it quickly devolved into a system of committing disgusting acts against the Chinese civilian population. Ideologically, a distorted interpretation of Bushido glorified death and instilled a profound contempt for surrender. Japanese soldiers were taught that being captured was the ultimate dishonor, which in turn fostered a brutal disregard for enemy soldiers who laid down their arms. This was compounded by a legal vacuum. Japan had signed but pointedly not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. This effectively left Chinese captives without any legal protection. To make matters even worse, this institutional mindset was underpinned by a pervasive dehumanizing of the Chinese population. Official military training manuals even suggested that new soldiers should get the opportunity to execute captive combatants. The march to Nanjing became a grim foreshadowing of the massacre to come. Eyewitness accounts and soldiers' own diaries describe acts such as massacring the populations of entire villages simply as something to do to pass the time. Now, given the platform we're on, I can't even fully go into the details of what these Japanese soldiers did during these massacres. What I can say, though, is that you should imagine the worst things possible, double the cruelty and violence, and then you'll potentially be somewhat close. This was the world in which this contest took place. It wasn't an aberration, but rather, it was a publicly celebrated instance of the Army's standard operating procedure. The propaganda machine didn't invent the extreme levels of violence. It merely selected one small part of it, stripped it of the horrors against women and children, and repackaged it as a heroic game for the home front. To understand the historical debate, one must return to the original articles themselves. The story was not a single report, but a serialized narrative, a piece of wartime theater that unfolded over 4 key installments. It was featured in the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shinbun and its sister paper, the Osaka Mainichi Shinbun, between November 30th and December 13th, 1937. The progression was designed to build suspense and keep the public engaged, transforming mass carnage into a weekly cliffhanger. The journalistic style was vivid and personal. The first article on November 30th set the stage, introducing the two quote-unquote competitors, their prize swords, and the initial scores. The reports also made it very clear that these two men were engaging in non-stop, brutal hand-to-hand combat, which is important to keep in mind. After all, the reality of the contest would turn out to be so much darker. Subsequent reports updated the tallies, showing the race tightening as the army closed in on Nanjing. The final article on December 13th provided the dramatic conclusion, with both men surpassing the goal and cheerfully agreeing to extend their competition. The reports included details such as how traditional Japanese steelworking techniques were so superior that the blades were completely undamaged through all the carnage. Almost immediately after the story was rediscovered in the post-war era, its factuality came under question. Historians and even Japanese veterans noted the sheer improbability of the feat as described. Fighting over 100 men in fierce hand-to-hand combat would likely exhaust any soldier and render a katana blunted and useless. Notably, this blunt sword theory became a central pillar of the revisionist argument that the story was a complete fabrication. However, this line of argument focuses on a deliberate misdirection. The key to understanding what likely happened comes from Tsuyoshi Noda himself. After returning to Japan, he reportedly gave a speech in his hometown, where he made a crucial admission. He confessed that the tales of heroic combat were an exaggeration for the papers, saying that he had only slain 4 men in hand-to-hand combat. In reality, he told them the 2 men would offer the Chinese soldiers safety if they surrendered. The soldiers would then bind the men's hands, as if taking them prisoner. Then, the 2 men who were participating in the contest would engage in acts of simple, cowardly slaughter against the bound men, keeping a rough tally as they went. Thus it's clear that the revisionists attacked the propaganda lie, the heroic duels, in order to cast doubt on the historical truth of the crimes committed by the men. As Allied investigators prepared for the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, they sifted through mountains of Japanese documents. It was there that they found the newspaper articles from the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shinbun. What had been a source of domestic pride was now seen as a sick crime perpetrated against the Chinese populace. In 1947, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda were arrested by American forces and detained in Tokyo's Sugamo prison. They were soon extradited to China to stand trial before the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal, a body established by the nationalist government to bring Japanese criminals to justice. In the dock, they were joined by Captain Gunkichi Tanaka, an officer accused of personally slaughtering over 300 Chinese civilians at Nanjing with his swords. The trial was not, as some later claimed, based solely on the sensationalized newspaper reports. The men were charged with atrocities committed during the Battle of Nanjing and the subsequent massacre. The newspaper articles served as the crucial link that identified Mukai and Noda and placed them at the scene. In a profound historical irony, the very propaganda designed to bring them fame and glory became the instrument of their downfall. Without those celebratory articles, they might have vanished into the anonymity of the post-war world, two of the countless soldiers who committed atrocities and were never held to account. On December 18, 1947, all three men were found guilty. On January 28, 1948, Mukai and Noda, both 35 years old, faced a firing squad in the mountains outside Nanjing, the city where they had sought their disturbing glory. In the end, the historical consensus on the contest is one of profound and disturbing nuance. The event, as it was reported in 1937, a heroic sporting competition of hand-to-hand combat between two evenly matched warriors, was complete fiction. It was a piece of propaganda, skillfully crafted to dehumanize the enemy, promote Japanese supremacy, and transform a campaign into an exciting spectacle for the home front. Today, it's widely accepted that the core of the story did happen, and that the numbers reported likely weren't significant exaggerations. The true fabrication surrounding this twisted contest was to turn two cowardly criminals who were executing bound men into superhuman modern-day samurai warriors. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the video podcast, Lazy Chill History, by clicking the link in the description. The scene is a mass rally in Pyongyang on October 14, 1945. The city is electric with a mix of relief and uncertainty. After 35 years of brutal Japanese colonial rule, Korea is free, but its fate is being decided by foreign powers. In the north, the Soviet Red Army are the liberators, and they've gathered the people to present a hero. He's introduced as the legendary guerrilla commander, General Kim Il-sung, a name whispered in awe for his daring exploits against the Japanese occupiers. The crowd waits, expecting to see a seasoned, perhaps grizzled, veteran warrior. Instead, a boyish man in his early 30s, wearing the crisp uniform of a Soviet Red Army captain, steps to the microphone. A murmur of confusion and disappointment ripples through the crowd. This wasn't the larger-than-life general they had imagined. That moment of public bewilderment is the seed of the entire mystery surrounding the man who would eventually become North Korea's eternal president. The man before the crowd wasn't a demigod of legend, but an ambitious and politically astute guerrilla named Kim Song-ju, who had been carefully selected by his Soviet patrons. His entire subsequent rule, and the very foundation of the North Korean state, would be predicated on closing the gap between the man he was and the myth he needed to become. To understand the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, one must first understand the two parallel lives of its founder. There's the hagiography constructed by the state for their founding hero, and the far more complex reality pieced together by historians. We'll first explore the official, state-sanctioned legend taught to every North Korean from birth. Then we'll contrast it with the historical consensus and examine the persistent imposter theory as a symptom of this foundational deception. In North Korea, the story of Kim Il-sung doesn't begin with his birth, but rather it begins with his ancestors. The official story portrays his family as a long line of preordained patriotic revolutionaries, establishing what is known as the Mount Paktu bloodline. His great-grandfather is credited with leading the attack on the American merchant ship General Sherman in 1866. His father, Kim Hyung-jik, wasn't merely an activist, but a pioneer of Marxism who led the anti-Japanese independence movement. His mother, Kang Pan-sok, on the other hand, is venerated as the mother of the Korean nation, who embodied all that is virtuous about the Korean people. She's portrayed perhaps not entirely as a human entity, but as a vessel that was created through the collective will of the Korean people to give birth to their great liberator. This narrative frames the Kim family not as participants in the liberation struggle, but as its very heart and soul, destined to lead the nation. From this hallowed lineage, according to the official sources, the young Kim emerged as a revolutionary prodigy. Official anecdotes, taught to school children as historical fact, describe him vowing to defeat the Japanese imperialists at the tender age of 5 while sitting on his mother's knee. Other stories suggest that as a child, he lectured adults on Marxist principles, not due to anything that he had learned, but almost as if he was divinely ordained. Naturally, according to these official stories, these adults were shocked, baffled, and instantly converted to the cause. At just 14, he supposedly founded the movement that would eventually overthrow Japanese rule, a seminal moment in the nation's revolutionary history. His childhood is depicted as a series of heroic acts of resistance, from defacing Japanese textbooks to organizing his fellow students into acts of revolutionary mischief. The centerpiece of the legend is his role as the singular, brilliant commander of the entire Korean resistance against Japan. The official narrative places him at a secret guerrilla base on the slopes of the sacred Mount Paktu, the mythical birthplace of Dangun, the founder of the First Korean Kingdom. This location is no accident, and it deliberately fuses Kim's revolutionary struggle with Korea's deepest national myths. From this sacred ground, he is said to have single-handedly organized and led the Korean people's revolutionary army, from which he liberated the Korean people from Japan. In this telling, all other anti-Japanese resistance figures, many of whom were his superiors in reality, are either erased from history or demoted to the status of his loyal followers. Crucially, his son and heir, Kim Jong-il, is said to have been born in a humble log cabin at the Mount Paktu secret camp in 1942. This nativity was supposedly marked by divine omens, including a double rainbow appearing in the sky and a new star shining brightly in the heavens. When historians peel back the layers of propaganda, a starkly different picture emerges. The man who would rule North Korea for nearly half a century was born Kim Song-ju on April 15, 1912, in a village near Pyongyang. His family was not a lineage of revolutionaries, but was, ironically, part of Korea's small but influential Protestant community. His grandfather was a Protestant minister, and his father was even named after St. Peter. Like many Koreans resentful of Japanese rule, his family fled to Manchuria around 1920, seeking refuge and opportunity. It was in Manchuria, not Korea, that Kim Song-ju received his revolutionary education. He attended Chinese schools, and according to some who knew him later, he may have preferred to communicate in Chinese rather than Korean. As a teenager, he was drawn into the world of underground Chinese communist youth organizations and was briefly jailed for his activities. His path wasn't a uniquely Korean one, and it was forged within the broader, communist-led anti-Japanese struggle in Manchuria. He joined a Chinese-led guerrilla force and proved to be a legitimately capable and courageous fighter, eventually rising to become a division commander by his mid-20s. It was during this period, around 1935, that he adopted the name Kim Il-sung, a name already famous and associated with an earlier, legendary anti-Japanese hero. While he was one of the more effective Korean commanders in the region, historians believe he was a mid-level officer in a Chinese-led army, taking orders from Chinese superiors. He wasn't the supreme commander of a unified Korean force by any means. The historical record shows that by late 1940, the elite Japanese Kwantung Army had effectively crushed the guerrilla resistance in Manchuria. Kim and the remnants of his unit were forced to flee across the border into the Soviet Union. He spent the remainder of the conflict, from late 1940 until Japan's surrender in 1945, in a Soviet military camp near Khabarovsk. There, he was commissioned as a captain in the Soviet Red Army's 88th Rifle Brigade, a special unit composed of exiled Chinese and Korean fighters. It was here, in a Soviet camp in 1941, that his son was born. The child, who would later be known as Kim Jong-il, wasn't given a revolutionary Korean name, but a Russian one, Yuri Kim. The chasm between the man and the myth gave rise to a persistent and sensational rumor, which has come to be termed the imposter theory. This theory claims that the man who returned to Pyongyang in 1945 wasn't the guerrilla fighter Kim Il-sung at all, but a fraud named Kim Song-ju. Under this theory, he had stolen the identity of a much older, more famous, and genuinely legendary anti-Japanese hero who had perished in battle. This idea flourished in the chaotic post-war environment, fueled by Korean confusion at the 1945 rally and by early Western intelligence reports. There's even a now declassified CIA dossier that treated the claim as credible, suspecting the Soviets inserted their agent into the Korean fray. Despite its durability as a piece of Cold War propaganda, the academic consensus has thoroughly debunked the literal imposter theory. The evidence against it is definitive, and witnesses who knew Kim Song-ju both before and after his time in the Soviet Union confirmed he was the same person. Japanese Kwantung Army records from the 1930s specifically identify the young guerrilla commander, using the alias Kim Il-sung, as a significant and wanted resistance figure. Most conclusively, his personal file has been found in Russian archives, confirming his identity and career path from Manchurian guerrilla to Soviet Red Army captain. However, the real significance of the imposter theory isn't its factual accuracy, but what its existence reveals. In a political sense, the man presented in 1945 was an imposter. The Soviets were presenting a 33-year-old captain as the legendary general the people expected to see. However, the real legendary general who first went by the name Kim Il-sung was Kim Kung-chan, and he was in his 60s when he fell in combat in 1942. By 1945, Kim Il-sung had already been using that same name for over a decade. Essentially, the imposter theory is an urban legend born from a kernel of truth. Kim Il-sung did take the name of someone much more famous in the resistance movement, but he actively used this name long before he was the front runner to lead a communist Korea. It's a distorted echo of the population's legitimate confusion and the regime's foundational act of political misdirection. The theory is a ghost born from the fog of a propaganda campaign, a symptom of a much deeper deception about who Kim Il-sung truly was and where his authority came from. When Kim returned to Korea in 1945, he was a political unknown. He had no independent power base and faced numerous, more prominent rivals from domestic communist and nationalist factions. His sole claim to power was the backing of a foreign occupying army, the Soviet Union, which saw him as a pliable asset who spoke Russian. To survive and consolidate power, he needed more than Soviet tanks. He needed a compelling narrative of his exploits. The creation of the Kim Il-sung myth was a calculated and essential political project. It recast him from a legitimate combatant against the Japanese to the sole liberator of the nation, providing him with the heroic, nationalist legitimacy he desperately lacked. By establishing himself as the singular leader of the revolution, he could brand all rivals as traitors or factionalists, justifying their ruthless purges in the 1950s. Most importantly, by linking his family to the sacred Mount Paktu and the mythical origins of the Koreans, he laid the ideological groundwork for a hereditary succession. This, of course, is a concept entirely alien to Marxism, but this myth transformed him from a communist premier like any other into a dynastic founder whose family still rules North Korea.